2, where I'm talking about the history of autism as discussed in a different key. The book, A Different Key. So I was just saying in my previous video how it's very difficult to determine what exactly autism is, and this has been a problem all the way through history. Now, Victor Lotter, a psychotherapist, designed a questionnaire that he mailed out to every school in Middlesex County, and this was in the 1960s. And Lotter became the final arbiter of who counted and who did not in history's first ever prevalence study of autism. The checklist had 22 items. For example, spends most of time on his or her own. Me. Carries or collects curious objects such as stones or tins. Me. often uses a special or peculiar voice. Funny enough, I used to do that a lot when I was a kid. I used to put on a voice. I don't know if any of you did that. That's interesting. Very clumsy or awkward in body movements. Yeah. So that's just some of the things in Lotter's questionnaire. Lotter constructed this list by improvising. First, he relied on two criteria that Kanner claimed are the essence of autism. That's extreme self-isolation and obsessive insistence on the preservation of sameness. But he went beyond Kanner and he borrowed a second diagnostic framework, Creek's 9 points, and that was published in the British Medical Journal in May 1961. And these 9 criteria purported to define a schizophrenic syndrome in childhood, which was another of those terms being used interchangeably for children with autistic behaviours. A London psychiatrist, Mildred Creek, added traits like acute, excessive and seemingly illogical anxiety. Well, that certainly applies to me. Odd movements. But it was a vague list. It was open to very subjective interpretation. Now, Victor Lotter, he arbitrarily split the children into 2 groups, and he drew a line based on impairment. Those below the line he excluded. The point where the line was drawn was arbitrary. So in the end, 35 kids out of 78,000, or 4.5 in 10,000, were included, and that was the baseline against which all subsequent measurements of autism prevalence would be compared. And it was almost as if it was an objective and universal truth, which of course it wasn't. It was very subjective. But Lotter never saw it that way. He made it clear that with only a few minor alterations in assumptions he made, a few different choices about where to draw his line around the symptoms, his 4.5 statistic could have come at a higher, or could have come out higher or lower. Now, these blurred definitions led to unanswerable questions about whether different studies at different times were even talking about the same people. And this, by the way, was way back in the 1960s when they were having this discussion. So what is autism? It's still an ongoing debate. What causes what? The children Kanner has studied all shared at a minimum 2 traits. A difficulty processing language and a lack of social connection. But which, if either, caused the other? Was language impairment the primary deficit, which then interfered with social development by hampering social communication? Or was the social deficit the primary, which stifled language development? As so much of language learning depends on interaction with other people. And then, in the 1970s, along came Lorna Wing, Dr. Lorna Wing, a well-known psychiatrist, and she conducted the Camberwell study. And this was the problem. What she was looking at was the problem of how to account for people who were near misses. These were often relatives of people who had been diagnosed, who also showed some autistic traits, but not enough to merit a diagnosis. She wanted to see every child who was reported as displaying any traces of developmental disability more broadly defined impairment. For example, intellectual, any kind of learning disability, and scattered autistic traits, for example, repetitive interests. And because the old idea left out too many people who needed help. The effect of excluding those, she said, who do not fit neatly into the categories is not a sliding scale of severity, she said. As Wing says, nature never draws a line without smudging it. So the new edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders appeared in 1987, and Wing's imprint was obvious. In place of the 5 different diagnoses the previous edition had offered to people with autistic traits, this update grouped everyone together into just 2 categories. 1. Autistic disorder applied to people whose traits were closest to what Leo Kanner called autism. And 2. The broad catch-all label to serve as a diagnosis for all the near misses. People with impairing autistic traits that did not add up to classic autism was called PDD-NOS, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. And this was very much spectrum-inspired. Lorna Wing coined the term the autistic spectrum. So then the book moves on to Asperger's syndrome, and I'm probably going to have to come back to this in another video because this is probably going to run out very soon. But it talks about Asperger's, the history of Asperger's syndrome, because the children that Hans Asperger, the paediatrician Hans Asperger described, were different in important respects from Donald and the others that Kanner had written about, whose hallmark trait was a seeming indifference to humans and a nearly full-blown disengagement from them. Most of Asperger's boys, and it was boys, seemed to strive for connection with others. They were not aloof. They wanted to make friends, usually. But it was usually... But the connections they tried to form were usually with adults. And they failed to form friendships with their peer group. Even though they wanted friends, they failed to form friendships, and they were often bullied. They made little eye contact. They were literal-minded. They missed others' non-verbal signals. And they were often physically clumsy, extremely verbose. This was extremely verbose, very talkative, spoke more like grown-ups, but often they would lock on to just 1 or 2 very narrow subjects. And Asperger described them as being intellectually whole, so that was his way of saying without an intellectual disability. For example, Fritz, even at age 8, could solve problems and grasp the nuances of complex systems. Intellectual gifts. Most of the boys were more than capable of learning. Asperger cited for children he had treated who grew up to have successful careers, academics, musicians, etc. Now, Lorna Wing, Dr. Lorna Wing, she drew the English-speaking world to become interested in Asperger's in the 1980s, to the children that Asperger described. And it dawned on Wing how closely her triad of impairment fit those 4 boys from Austria. And the data from the Camberwell Register contained accounts of children who were quite intelligent and verbally proficient. As Wing made clear, her purpose in shining a spotlight on Asperger's paper had never been to codify his 1944 observations into a standalone diagnosis. She saw no clear boundaries separating the syndrome from other autistic disorders, and she did not foresee or intend that the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, a term she used only descriptively, would be handed out to thousands of individuals, or that it would be defined during the 1990s as distinct from the autism described by Kanner, because she saw it as essentially the same thing, just autism in those who were highly verbal and without intellectual disability. She simply wanted to bolster her idea of a spectrum. She wanted to show that the medical literature was filled with descriptions of highly verbal and intelligent individuals who, because they also manifested some autistic traits, belonged on the same spectrum with those whose language and intellect was less well developed. She was an activist, by the way, not just a psychiatrist. She had an autistic child. Her child was very severely autistic, profoundly autistic, and actually died, I think, by over-drinking water, if I remember correctly, which is a common stim for some autistics. But she was an activist because she was a mother as well of an autistic child, Susie. And she determined to get services for as many people as possible. she opposed breaking up the spectrum into multiple diagnoses. Okay, so I'm going to finish now, and I'm going to have to come back to this because I'm just getting up to the bit where Asperger and Lorna Wing had a meeting together, and they fundamentally disagreed on whether or not autism should be viewed as one or split up into different diagnoses, with Asperger wanting it to be split up because he saw his syndrome as fundamentally different to other types of autism, whereas Lorna Wing saw them as basically the same thing, but just expressed differently. Okay, so I will carry on talking about this another time, so thank you for watching.